I never imagined that a single broken water line could wipe out almost 50 head of cattle. And I definitely never imagined that the same people responsible for it would end up funding my ranch for the next half-century. Looking back now, the money isn't even the part I think about the most. It's the look on that developer's face when he finally realized he hadn't been negotiating with some stubborn old rancher. He'd been gambling with a piece of Texas history he never bothered to understand. My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm 53 years old, and my family has been raising cattle outside Lubbock since long before the highways, the subdivisions, and the fancy real estate brochures started calling this place the next great community. To me, it was never an investment. It was home. Every cedar fence post had a story. Every windmill reminded me of my grandfather. Every pasture carried memories of branding calves beside my dad before I was even tall enough to saddle a horse by myself. Ranching teaches you patience because the land doesn't care about your schedule. Rain comes when it wants. Drought stays longer than anyone hopes. Cabs arrive at 3 in the morning whether you're tired or not. You stop trying to control everything and learn to respect the things that keep life moving, especially water. Around here, water isn't just another utility. Water is life. Lose electricity for a day and you get annoyed. Lose water for 3 days in August, things start dying. That's why I paid attention the moment I saw the survey stakes appear across the fence. Within weeks, hundreds of acres that had always been quiet grassland turned into a construction site full of excavators, dump trucks, and men wearing bright safety vests who looked at my ranch like it was just another obstacle on a blueprint. The company called itself Silver Ridge Communities. Their billboards promised luxury living, resort-style amenities, walking trails, sparkling lakes, and dream homes starting in the high 700s. Every afternoon I'd watch trucks roll past while my border collie, Duke, barked at the dust clouds drifting across my pasture. My wife, Claire, kept telling me not to worry. Construction doesn't last forever, she'd say while pouring coffee on the porch. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But every conversation I had with their project managers left the same taste in my mouth. They smiled without listening. They nodded before interrupting. They acted like the ranch had already become part of their neighborhood. They just hadn't updated the map yet. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I heard engines where they shouldn't have been, not on their property, on mine. I drove the ATV toward the north pasture and found a bulldozer sitting half across the property line with fresh dirt piled beside a trench that absolutely hadn't existed the day before. I shut the engine off and just stared for a second because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were telling me. One of the operators climbed down, shrugged, and said, "Our survey crew marked this route yesterday." I pointed toward the old irrigation pipe sticking out of the dirt like a snapped bone. "That's my water line," I said. He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before answering. "You'll have to talk to the office." That was it. No apology, no urgency. Just another problem handed to somebody else. I called the superintendent immediately. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. Finally, someone answered from the corporate office and said they'd send someone to inspect the damage. By then, the August heat was already climbing past 100 degrees. I spent the rest of that day dragging temporary hoses across ground that should never have needed them, praying I could keep enough water flowing until repairs were made. Nobody came. Not that day. Not the next morning either. By the third sunrise, I wasn't thinking about legal claims or property lines anymore. I was thinking about survival. The cattle were restless. The watering troughs sat nearly empty. Dust hung in the air so thick it coated everything in a dull brown film. Duke wouldn't leave my side while I checked the fence line because even he seemed to know something was wrong. Then I found the first group lying near the dry trough, motionless. I remember taking my hat off without even realizing I'd done it. I remember kneeling beside one old cow I'd raised from a calf and putting my hand on her neck even though I already knew she was gone. There are moments in life that don't feel real until much later. That was one of them. By the end of the week, the number kept climbing, and with every loss I became less angry and more strangely calm. Anger burns hot. Determination burns longer. 3 days later, a polished white SUV rolled into my driveway. A man in an expensive suit stepped out carrying a leather folder, smiled like we were about to close a business deal, and slid a check across my kitchen table. $12,000, he said. "We believe that's a fair resolution." I looked at the check, then at him, and I couldn't help smiling, not because I accepted his offer, because for the first time since this nightmare began, I realized they had absolutely no idea whose land they had decided to underestimate. The man frowned, probably expecting me to argue over the amount, maybe threaten to call another lawyer or throw out some bigger number. Instead, I folded the check once, slid it back across the table, and asked him a question that caught him completely off guard. "Before you came here today, did anybody tell you where your subdivision gets its water?" He blinked, looked confused for a second, then forced another polished smile. Mr. Calloway, our engineers have taken care of all necessary approvals." I nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." He gathered his folder, stood up, and said he'd report that I declined their offer. Watching his SUV disappear down my gravel driveway, I had the strange feeling that I'd just witnessed the last moment anyone from Silver Ridge thought they were still in control. That afternoon, I walked into the small room my grandfather always called the archive. Most people would have called it a storage room, but every shelf held pieces of our family's history: weathered plat maps, handwritten journals, faded tax receipts, survey notes, and leather-bound folders older than I was. My grandfather believed paper outlived memory. "Folks forget conversations," he'd always tell me. "They don't forget ink." I pulled out the cedar box that hadn't been opened in years and spread the documents across the dining room table. Claire sat quietly beside me while I worked through page after page. Hours passed before I found exactly what I remembered hearing about as a teenager: the original property survey, water rights documentation, mineral reservations, old correspondence between neighboring ranch owners. Then there it was, a letter dated 1951. My great-grandfather had written permission allowing the neighboring ranch family to draw water from our deep well whenever needed. Not forever, not permanently, not legally binding. Just a simple courtesy between neighbors who trusted each other enough that nobody imagined lawyers would ever become part of the conversation. There wasn't a recorded easement anywhere in the county records. No perpetual agreement. No deed restriction. Nothing. I stared the papers for a long time before Claire finally broke the silence. "You're thinking the subdivision is using that same agreement?" I looked up. "I'm thinking they build 99 homes, assuming a handshake from 70 years ago was the same thing as a legal contract." The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office carrying copies of every document. The clerk recognized my last name immediately. Rural counties are like that. Families don't just own land. They become part of local history. After reviewing everything, she quietly leaned back in her chair and said, "If this is accurate, someone made a very expensive assumption." I filed formal notice terminating all informal access permissions effective immediately. No drama, no shouting, just paperwork. Funny thing about paperwork, it doesn't make much noise while it's changing somebody's future. 3 days later, my phone started ringing before sunrise. The first call came from a homeowner I'd never met. Groundwater, low pressure. Then another call. No water upstairs. Another one. Toilets backing up. By lunch, the county fire marshal was on site after discovering several hydrants couldn't maintain minimum pressure. I wasn't there when they placed the bright red notices at the subdivision entrance, but every local news station made sure the entire county saw them that evening. Luxury development faces water crisis. I almost felt sorry for the families who had emptied retirement accounts to buy their dream homes. Almost, because none of them had driven across the fence line to ask what happened when construction crews destroyed the irrigation system keeping my livestock alive. Their anger had been pointed at the wrong people until reality finally caught up with everyone involved. The homeowners demanded answers. Silver Ridge blamed subcontractors. The subcontractors blamed survey crews. Survey crews blamed outdated maps. Nobody wanted to admit the simplest truth. Somebody had assumed my ranch didn't matter. The HOA called an emergency meeting inside the neighborhood clubhouse. A friend of mine who serviced HVAC systems there later told me he'd never heard grown adults yell like that outside of divorce court. Residents wanted refunds. Investors threatened lawsuits. One retired firefighter reportedly slammed a binder onto the table and shouted, "You sold us homes without verifying the water source." Nobody answered him because there wasn't a good answer. Meanwhile, I received certified letters from Silver Ridge's attorneys accusing me of interfering with essential infrastructure. Reading those letters almost made me laugh. They talked about community responsibility while conveniently ignoring the dead cattle lying in photographs attached to my own attorney's response. Their lawsuit lasted less time than some weekend fishing trips I've taken. During a preliminary hearing, the judge asked one question that seemed to suck all the confidence out of Silver Ridge's legal team. "Counsel, Can you identify the recorded easement granting your client perpetual water access? Silence. Papers shuffled. Someone whispered behind them. Finally, the lead attorney admitted they could not. The judge looked toward my attorney, glanced through the property records, and simply nodded. Motion denied. Case dismissed. Just like that. Outside the courthouse, television cameras crowded around both legal teams. Silver Ridge's spokesperson refused questions and hurried toward a waiting SUV. Reporters asked whether I'd consider restoring water immediately. I answered honestly, I'm willing to negotiate a legal agreement. I was willing before my cattle died too. That interview spread faster than I expected. Suddenly I wasn't the stubborn rancher standing in the way of progress. I was the man whose property had quietly supported an entire development without anyone bothering to ask permission. Within another week, things became even uglier for Silver Ridge. Homeowners filed a class action claiming the developer failed to disclose critical infrastructure risks before closing sales. Banks started questioning property values. Potential buyers disappeared almost overnight. For sale signs multiplied every weekend. Then came the call I'd been expecting from the beginning. It wasn't another attorney. It wasn't another middle manager. It was the company's CEO himself. His voice sounded calm, almost too calm. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "I believe it's time the two of us had a conversation." I looked out across the pasture where a fresh group of calves wandered behind their mothers, took a slow sip of coffee, and answered, "I think you're finally right." I didn't know exactly how that meeting would end, but for the first time since the bulldozer crossed my fence, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This conversation was going to happen on my terms, not theirs. 2 mornings later, a black pickup rolled through my front gate instead of another polished luxury SUV, and somehow, that tiny detail told me this meeting was going to be different. The man climbing out wasn't dressed like someone arriving to win an argument. He wore faded jeans, dusty boots that looked almost brand new, and a plain blue work shirt with the company logo stitched above the pocket. He looked exhausted, not the kind of tired that comes from staying up too late, the kind that settles into your face when every phone call brings another problem you can't solve. He introduced himself as Daniel Mercer, the CEO of Silver Ridge Communities, and after we shook hands, he glanced across the pasture where my cattle had finally started settling back into something resembling normal life. "Beautiful place," he said quietly. "It was," I answered, "before your bulldozers showed up." He didn't argue. He didn't offer another rehearsed apology. Instead, he simply nodded and followed me onto the porch. Claire brought out 2 mugs of coffee before disappearing back inside, giving us both the privacy we needed. For almost a full minute, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the wind pushing through the mesquite trees and a windmill creaking somewhere beyond the barn. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I've spent the last 8 days sitting in meetings where everybody wants someone else to blame. The engineers blame the surveyors. The surveyors blame the contractors. The contractors blame the utility consultants. The attorneys blame everyone. Meanwhile, 99 families are wondering whether they bought homes that may never recover their value." I looked out toward the north pasture before answering. 47 of my cattle never recovered either. He lowered his eyes. "I know." "No," I replied calmly. "You know the number. There's a difference." That sentence hung between us longer than either of us expected. After another moment, he leaned forward, resting both elbows on his knees. "Then tell me what you need." I stood up, walked inside, and returned with a thick folder my attorney and I had prepared days earlier. I placed it on the table without saying a word. He opened it, slowly flipping through each page until he reached the financial terms. His eyebrows lifted almost immediately. 50 years? He asked. "Yes." "Annual access fees for every occupied home?" "Yes." "Automatic 4% increases every year?" I nodded again. He kept reading. "Quarterly water quality testing at their expense. Annual prepaid access before the first gallon flowed. Written approval required for any excavation near my property. 72-hour cure period for missed payments before water service could legally be suspended." He closed the folder halfway and looked directly at me. "My board is going to hate every page of this." I couldn't help smiling. "Your board didn't lose 47 head of cattle." He actually laughed then, not because anything was funny, but because he finally understood there wasn't a shortcut left. "They're going to call this highway robbery." "Maybe," I answered. "I call it finally putting a price on something your company assumed was free." We spent another 2 hours going over language line by line. There was no shouting, no threats, just 2 men sitting across from each other with completely different definitions of fairness until reality slowly forced those definitions to meet in the middle. At one point, Daniel looked around the ranch and quietly asked, "How many generations has your family been here?" "Mine makes 15. He shook his head slowly. "We've only existed as a company for 22 years. "Exactly," I said. "That's why paperwork matters. Companies come and go. Land remembers everything." When he finally reached the signature page, he held the pen for several seconds before signing his name. As he slid the contract back across the table, he said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "This is the most expensive lesson our company has ever learned." I signed beside him and answered, "Good lessons usually are." Within 10 days, the agreement was officially recorded. Water service returned. Fire hydrants passed inspection. The county lifted its emergency restrictions, and little by little the neighborhood settled down. Families began planting flowers again. Kids rode bicycles through streets that had been filled with moving trucks only weeks earlier. The HOA board didn't survive the next election. Several executives quietly resigned before the year ended, and Silver Ridge completely rewrote its due diligence procedures for future developments. As for me, I never celebrated. I used the first payment to replace every damaged irrigation line with stronger pipe, drilled a backup well so no one could ever leave my livestock vulnerable again, rebuilt sections of fencing that had been destroyed during construction, and funded an agricultural scholarship at the local community college in honor of my grandfather, the man who taught me that a handshake means something, but only until someone decides it doesn't. Every January, another payment arrives like clockwork. Claire jokes that the subdivision sends us a very expensive Christmas present every year, and I usually laugh because she's not wrong. People still stop me at the feed store and ask the same question. If you could go back, would you have taken the $12,000? My answer never changes. It was never about the money. It was about respect. Once people believe they can put a dollar amount on your dignity, they'll keep negotiating until they own a little piece of it. I wasn't willing to sell mine. Now I'd like to hear from you. If someone destroyed your livelihood, brushed off your loss, and offered what they thought was just enough money to make you disappear, what would you have done? Would you have accepted the check and moved on? Or fought for accountability no matter how long it took? Share your thoughts in the comments, because I honestly think reasonable people can disagree on where justice ends and revenge begins. And if stories like this remind you that patience, preparation, and standing your ground can sometimes beat money and power, make sure you subscribe, because I've got plenty more stories that prove the biggest victories often belong to the people everyone underestimated.